Let's now take a look at the 3 different ways of declaring variables in JavaScript. So up until this point, we have always used the let keyword to declare variables. However, there are also const and var. Now, let and const were introduced in ES6, and so they are modern JavaScript, while the var keyword is the old way of declaring variables. So let's learn how they are different and which one to use in which situations. And let's again start by getting rid of this code. Actually, all I will do is move this to the end. And in the future, I will just do this before recording the next video. So anyway, we use the let keyword to declare variables that can change later. So basically during the execution of our program. And that's exactly what we did here. So we used let to declare JavaScript is fun, and then we changed that later from true to yes. Right? For example, or another example I would say is, let's set the age to 30 at one point of the program, and then in another point of the program, we can change it to something else. For example, when the person turns 31. And then the age, of course, changes from 30 to 31. And so it's perfectly okay to declare a variable with let at one point in the program and then later assign a new value to it. In technical terms, we call this reassigning a value to a variable, or also we say that we mutate the age variable in this case. So it was 30 and now it's 31. And so we mutated the variable. Okay, so that's a term that you will hear all the time in the JavaScript world. So when we need to mutate a variable, that's the perfect use case for using let. And that also counts for the case that we want to declare empty variables. So for example, as we did here, where we declared an empty year and then later reassigned that variable to 1991. And sometimes we actually do this in practice. For example, when we want to declare all the variables at the top of a file, but only assign actual values to them later in the program, for example, based on some condition. Now, on the other hand, we use the const keyword to declare variables that are not supposed to change at any point in the future. So the value in a const variable cannot be changed. For example, let's say the birth year, 1991, for example. If we then tried to reassign that, let's say to 1990, it should not work. So let's test that. And indeed, we get a type error. So assignment to constant variable. And so that's exactly what the const keyword does. It creates a variable that we cannot reassign, or in technical terms, an immutable variable. So a variable that cannot be mutated. Okay? And the birth year is a perfect example for that, because in fact, the birth year of a person can never change, while the age, of course, can change. And so that's why we used let for the age and const for the birth year. Okay? That makes sense? Now, the fact that variables created with const are immutable also means that we cannot declare empty const variables. For example, this is not legal. So let's comment out this one here, again with command or control slash, so that it doesn't get in our way here. And then reload. And then we get an error, missing initializer in const declaration. And so this error message means that when using const, we need basically an initial value. All right, so just like here. Now, with these 2 different ways of declaring variables, you will probably ask, should I use let or should I use const to declare a new variable? Well, as a best practice for writing clean code, I always recommend to use const by default and let only when you are really sure that the variable needs to change at some point in the future. For example, when you have a variable that's really never supposed to change, like this birth year, you should always use const. Also, if you are sure that the age variable is never changing inside your program, you should declare it using const as well. The reason for this is that it's a good practice to have as little variable mutations or variable changes as possible, because changing variables introduces a potential to create bugs, so basically errors in your code. So again, by default, always just use const, and let when you're sure that the value of the variable needs to change at some point in your code. And so from now on, I will probably use the const way of declaring variables as much as possible. Now, there's also a third way in JavaScript of declaring variables, which is the var keyword. But this one should actually be completely avoided, okay? However, we should still know how it works for legacy reasons, because you will see this maybe in older code bases or some older tutorials that you find online. So let's take a look at how it works. So var is basically the old way of defining variables prior to ES6. And at first sight, it works actually pretty much the same as let. So we can write var job equals programmer, and then just like with let, we can change the value of the variable later. Just like this. Let's take this one out and let's just reload. And we didn't get any errors, which means that it's basically allowed to mutate this job variable when we use var, right? Now, although it looks like var and let are very similar, below the surface they're actually pretty different. And actually there are also many differences between let, const, and var. So between all three of them. And you will learn all about these differences later in section 7, because this is actually really important stuff. And I know that I keep saying that you will learn some topics later in the course, but the truth is that learning is really not linear. It cannot happen in a linear way. So you sometimes need more advanced things right now, even without understanding them. But that's no problem, because you will understand them eventually. So right now, it would really not be useful for you to know that let is block scoped and that var is function scoped, right? Because you don't even know what a block or what a function really is. And so we will learn about these differences in section 7. For now, what matters is that you should basically never use var, okay? Now, just to finish, some people will probably point out that we actually don't even have to declare variables at all, because it's actually not mandatory. We can just write something like this. Last name equals Schmettmann, in my case. And then we can just use this variable name, in this case by logging it to the console, and JavaScript will happily execute this script even without us declaring the variable, right? We didn't use let, nor const, nor var in this case, but it still worked. However, this is actually a pretty terrible idea, because this doesn't create the variable in the current so-called scope. Instead, JavaScript will create a property on the global object. And once again, you will understand a little bit later what all of this means. But what matters is that you should always properly declare variables, okay? Never just write a variable like this without really declaring it. Great, you're doing great progress here, even though our code doesn't really do anything yet, and we're not really writing any real applications yet, right? But we still need to get some fundamentals down before we can do that. And so that's really important. And that's why I'm stressing all the little details about everything here. And I hope you see how important that is for your progress. Okay? And don't worry, we will get to the cool stuff even a bit later in this first section. Okay? But for now, in the next video, let's talk about operators in JavaScript.